Before we begin, we publish new content every day. So be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. My son Richard stood in our living room just hours after we buried his father, laughing with relatives about how the $92 million would be handled quickly, saying I didn't even know how to use a credit card. I stood on the staircase in my black funeral dress, invisible to everyone below, listening to my own child erase me from existence while my husband's body was still warm in the ground. Arthur had been gone for only 3 days, and already they were redesigning our home. My granddaughter Isabel walked around with her iPad, using some 3D design app to plan where the gym would go once they moved me to a nursing home. My grandson Leo was placing bright neon stickers on everything valuable in the house, each one labeled Leo's. The grandfather clock Arthur's father had given us, the Steinway piano I had played for 40 years, even the crystal vase from our wedding day. Everything that held memories was being claimed like territory in a war I didn't know had started. I had spent 37 years stepping back, making myself smaller, letting Arthur shine while I handled everything behind the scenes. I had my degree from MIT in software engineering, but when Arthur's company started struggling 20 years ago, I made the choice to support him fully. I sold my father's entire stock portfolio, everything I had inherited, and quietly invested it into Arthur's failing business through a shell company so he could save face. I wrote the algorithm that became the backbone of Brightwood Industries, registering the patent under a pen name so Arthur could take credit and rebuild his confidence. I thought I was being a good wife, a supportive partner. I never imagined my sacrifice would make me invisible to my own family. Richard's wife, Clarice, approached me with that fake sympathy she had perfected over the years. She was already directing the cleaning staff to pack up Arthur's personal items, calling them old and outdated. When I tried to protest, she smiled sweetly and asked if I wanted some soup, adding that it was what I did best. The condescension in her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. She had been slowly poisoning my relationship with my son for years, convincing him that I was just a helpless housewife who couldn't understand the complexities of business or money. The next morning, I woke up to find my belongings being moved from the master bedroom to a small room in the basement that had been used for storage. When I confronted Richard about this, he handed me a thick stack of papers and told me it was time to be practical about my care. The documents were power of attorney forms that would essentially give him control over my health decisions and finances. He said I was getting older, and my mind wasn't as sharp as it used to be, that he was just looking out for me. Clarice accidentally spilled coffee all over my wedding photo albums while this conversation was happening. She apologized without any trace of sincerity in her voice, and I watched 25 years of carefully preserved memories dissolve into brown stains. That night, in the cold basement room they had assigned me, I realized they weren't just trying to take my money, they were trying to erase me completely, to make me disappear so thoroughly that it would be as if I had never existed at all. I sat on the narrow bed surrounded by boxes of my displaced possessions and felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Not sadness or hurt, but a cold, crystalline anger that cut through all the confusion and self-doubt. I opened an old shoebox I had hidden under the bed years ago. Inside was an ancient cell phone and a small notebook filled with numbers and codes Arthur and I had created together. He had been the face of our partnership, but he had never forgotten that we were partners. He had protected certain things, prepared for possibilities I had hoped would never come to pass. I dialed a number I had memorized but never needed to use. When Peterson, our family lawyer, answered on the second ring, I could hear the relief in his voice. He said he had been waiting for my call. I told him it was time to activate what Arthur and I had privately called the Nightingale Protocol. There was a long pause before Peterson replied that he would make the arrangements immediately. The next morning, I watched from my basement window as Richard and Clarice stood in the kitchen, making plans for renovating the entire house. They were discussing which walls to tear down, where to put the wine cellar, how to modernize everything. They spoke about the house as if I were already dead, as if my 40 years of life within these walls had left no trace worth preserving. Isabel was measuring spaces for her future bedroom, and Leo was making lists of expensive toys he wanted to buy with his inheritance. They had changed the Wi-Fi password and disconnected my phone line, thinking they could isolate me completely. But they had underestimated both my intelligence and Arthur's foresight. While they planned their new life, I was setting much larger wheels in motion. Peterson filed an immediate court injunction, preventing any sale or transfer of assets until the will could be properly read and all claims settled. When Richard called the lawyer screaming about the delay, Peterson calmly told him that there were complications that needed to be resolved first. Later that day, I received a call on the old phone from Jessica Vance, a woman I had known since graduate school, who had become one of the foremost experts in intellectual property analysis. She was flying in from Boston to examine certain documents that Peterson had sent her. As she reviewed the handwriting samples and patent applications, she confirmed what I already knew. The foundational algorithm that had made Brightwood Industries profitable was mine, written in my hand, carrying my encrypted signature that only someone with my specific mathematical background could have created. Meanwhile, Richard and Clarice were becoming increasingly frustrated with the legal delays. They had already made promises to contractors and had started spending money they assumed would be flowing freely. Clarice had ordered new furniture for the renovated house, and Richard had made a down payment on a yacht. They were living as if the inheritance was already in their accounts, becoming more reckless and arrogant by the day. The formal reading of the will took place in Peterson's conference room 2 weeks after Arthur's death. Richard, Clarice, and my grandchildren arrived dressed in expensive clothes, their faces radiating confidence and entitlement. They barely acknowledged me as I sat quietly in the corner, wearing a simple black dress that made me look like exactly what they believed me to be: a grieving widow with no understanding of financial matters. Peterson began by reading the standard portions of the will, but then he paused and mentioned that Arthur had included a special audio addendum, recorded just weeks before his death. When Arthur's voice filled the room, clear and deliberate, the atmosphere changed completely. He explained that he had been carefully observing how his family treated his wife, documenting every instance of disrespect and cruelty. For each transgression, $10 million would be deducted from Richard's inheritance. As Peterson played back security footage that Arthur had secretly installed throughout the house, we all watched Richard, Clarice, and the children treating me like a servant in my own home. Every cruel comment, every dismissive gesture, every moment they had made me feel worthless was preserved in high definition. By the time the accounting was finished, Richard's inheritance had been reduced from $80 million to $12 million. But Peterson wasn't finished. He explained that Arthur and I had been co-founders of Brightwood Industries, not just husband and wife. The initial investment that had saved the company 20 years ago had been structured as a convertible bond, giving me the right to claim majority ownership at any time. All the documentation was in order, signed and notarized, waiting for the moment when I chose to exercise this option. The room fell completely silent as the implications became clear. I wasn't just Arthur's widow waiting for my allowance. I was the majority shareholder of a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I controlled everything they had been fighting over. Everything they had assumed belonged to them. When Jessica Vance entered the room and presented her analysis of the patent documents, Richard's face went completely white. The core algorithm that generated most of Brightwood Industries' revenue had been written by me, belonged to me, and had been licensed to the company under terms that I could revoke at any time. Every dollar of profit that had funded their lifestyle for the past 20 years had flowed from my intellectual property. Richard jumped up and accused me of lying to his father, of deceiving everyone about who I really was. His voice cracked as he shouted that I was just a housewife, that I couldn't possibly have created something so complex. I stood up slowly and looked at my son. This 40-year-old man who had never bothered to really know his own mother. I told him he was right about one thing. I did know how to make soup. I had made it thousands of times over the years, standing in the kitchen while my mind worked on problems that were far more complicated than anything he had ever attempted to solve. While I stirred and seasoned and served, I was running calculations, optimizing algorithms, and building the technological foundation that would support his privileged life. He saw a woman in an apron. His father saw a brilliant partner. And starting immediately, the board of directors would see their new CEO. The security guards Peterson had quietly stationed outside the conference room escorted Richard and his family from the building. They had 24 hours to vacate the house that Clarice had been so eager to renovate. Everything they had taken for granted, every assumption they had made about their future, evaporated in a single afternoon. The next morning, I walked through my home as Richard and Clarice hastily packed their belongings. The house felt different already. Quieter, but not empty. Peaceful rather than tense. I methodically removed each of Leo's stickers from my possessions, peeling away the bright labels that had tried to claim ownership of my life. When Clarice screamed at me on her way out, calling me cruel and heartless, I simply told her that I had given them a loving home, and they had turned it into hell. We were even. Later that week, I stood in the boardroom of Brightwood Industries, wearing a custom-tailored suit that made me feel powerful for the first time in decades. The executives who had known me only as Arthur's quiet wife looked nervous and uncertain. I had spent years observing this company from the sidelines, understanding its weaknesses and potential better than anyone else in the room. I told them that Arthur had built a good company, but I was there to make it great. We had work to do, innovations to pursue, and a legacy to expand. As I settled into the chair at the head of the table, I realized that my real inheritance wasn't money or property. It was the freedom to finally be myself completely, to use every skill I had developed and every lesson I had learned. The woman who had been dismissed as a simple housewife was gone. In her place sat someone who had always existed but had chosen to remain hidden. I was 63 years old, and my real life was just beginning. The steel had always been there, beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Now, it would be the foundation for everything I built going forward, unbreakable and unmistakably mine. 3 months later, I stood in my transformed office, watching through floor-to-ceiling windows as construction crews broke ground on our new research facility. The company that Richard thought he would inherit was already becoming something far more ambitious than Arthur had ever imagined. I had hired 3 teams of MIT graduates, all brilliant women who reminded me of myself at their age, hungry for challenges that matched their intelligence. The board meetings had been difficult at first. Several members resigned when they realized I intended to make substantial changes rather than simply maintaining Arthur's legacy. Those who remained quickly learned that the soft-spoken woman they had occasionally seen at company Christmas parties possessed a strategic mind that could dissect complex problems with surgical precision. When I proposed expanding into artificial intelligence and quantum computing, using my original algorithm as the foundation, they initially expressed skepticism. 6 weeks later, when our first prototype generated more revenue in a month than some divisions produced in a year, the skepticism transformed into eager attention. Richard had attempted to contest the will, hiring expensive lawyers who promised to prove I had manipulated my elderly husband. The legal challenge lasted exactly 47 days before his attorneys advised him to abandon the case. The documentation was ironclad, the patents were indisputable, and the audio recordings of his own words had been authenticated by 3 independent experts. More damaging to his position, the financial forensics revealed that he had been systematically overcharging the company for consulting services that existed only on paper, essentially stealing from his own family's business for years. Meanwhile, Clarice had started a social media campaign designed to portray me as a bitter woman who had stolen her children's rightful inheritance. She posted carefully edited videos that made her appear to be a devoted daughter-in-law who had been betrayed by a vindictive mother figure. The strategy backfired spectacularly when Jessica Vance released a detailed technical analysis of my contributions to Brightwood Industries, complete with mathematical proofs that only someone with advanced engineering training could have created. Suddenly, Clarice's narrative of the helpless housewife became obviously absurd to anyone who understood the complexity of my work. The grandchildren proved to be more adaptable than their parents. Isabel, now 14, had apparently inherited some mathematical ability and began reaching out through carefully worded emails. She never directly apologized for the stickers and the redesign plans, but she asked questions about programming and algorithm design that showed genuine curiosity. I responded with small challenges, simple coding problems that gradually increased in complexity. When she solved them correctly, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Pride in my family that wasn't mixed with disappointment or resentment. Leo remained distant, influenced by his parents' bitterness, but I noticed him watching from across the street sometimes. When I worked in my garden, he was 16 now, old enough to begin questioning the stories he had been told about his evil grandmother. I left books about engineering and innovation on the front porch, where he might see them during his surveillance missions. Whether he took them or not, I never knew. But the books always disappeared. The house felt alive again in ways I had forgotten were possible. I converted Arthur's study into a workshop where I could build prototypes and test new ideas. The piano that Leo had claimed with his neon sticker became central to my evening routine. I played Bach and Chopin, while my subconscious processed the technical problems I encountered during the day. The mathematical patterns in music helping to unlock solutions that pure logic sometimes missed. Most surprisingly, I wasn't lonely. For decades, I had convinced myself that I needed my family's approval and presence to feel complete. The silence that had initially felt like punishment gradually revealed itself to be freedom. I could think without interruption, create without judgment, and make decisions based entirely on my own values and priorities. The woman who had spent 37 years making herself smaller was finally expanding to fill all the space available to her. 6 months after Arthur's death, I received an unexpected visitor. Richard appeared at my front door on a rainy Thursday evening, looking exhausted and significantly older than his 40 years. He didn't demand entry or shout accusations. Instead, he asked quietly if we could talk. I led him to the kitchen where I had served him thousands of meals over the years, where Clarice had spilled coffee on my wedding albums, where so many of our family's dramas had unfolded. He told me that his marriage was failing, that Clarice blamed him for losing the inheritance and had become increasingly cruel in her criticism of his handling of the situation. The $12 million he had received was substantial by most standards, but it wouldn't support the lifestyle they had planned or the debts they had already accumulated. More than the financial stress, he said he was haunted by the recordings Peterson had played, seeing himself through my eyes for the first time, and not recognizing the man he had become. I listened without offering forgiveness or sympathy, watching my son wrestle with consequences he had created through his own choices. When he asked if there was any way to repair our relationship, I told him the truth. The woman he had dismissed and diminished no longer existed. The person sitting across from him was someone he had never bothered to know. Someone who had built a successful company while he was busy taking credit for her work. If he wanted a relationship with that person, he would need to earn it through actions rather than words, and the process would take years rather than months. As I walked him to the door that night, I realized that my transformation was finally complete. I had moved beyond anger into something far more powerful, indifference to his approval and clarity about my own worth. The steel that had always formed my core was now visible to everyone, including myself. At 63, I had discovered that the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property, but the courage to claim the life you were always meant to live.